It's Monday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. Joining me, Conservative MP Stephen Crabb, SNP MP Alan Smith, GP Claire Gerada and former Government Special Advisor Salma Shah. Today, did anyone spend their Sunday evening like this?
3, 2, 1.
Nightclubs reopening are just one sign of COVID restrictions being eased in England today.
We think today is reckless, and it is a day of uncertainty for thousands of people who will be getting on buses and trains.
It is a cautious move to bringing back normality to our lives, getting our businesses back on their feet.
The Prime Minister is isolating here, but that wasn't always the plan.
It ensures that the PM, the Chancellor, can conduct the most essential business.
We did look briefly at the idea of us taking part in the pilot scheme.
And will under-18s be vaccinated? We expect to hear later today. So, as you saw in the headlines, nightclubs in England will open for the first time since the pandemic began. Hospitality will open fully. Social distancing rules have gone. Face coverings are no longer mandatory, but they are advised. Scotland has put the whole country on the lowest level of COVID restrictions from today, so a major easing of many of the rules. But face masks are still mandatory in certain settings. A full reopening is due on August the 9th. Full easing of restrictions are still to come in Wales and Northern Ireland. Let's take you through a couple of the newspaper headlines. This is The Times. Be cautious. You're going to hear that word again and again, urges Prime Minister as COVID predicted to surge. And this is the headline on the front page of the Herald. Don't buy into the Freedom Day hype, warns Sturgeon. So both the First Minister and the Prime Minister on the same page in terms of urging that caution. My question to open the programme with all of our guests is, will you do anything differently from today? Stephen.
Well, in Wales, of course, we have a different set of rules, so it's not quite the same as the easing that we're seeing in England. But the date I'm looking forward to in Wales is the 7th of August, when we can meet up in a pub with more than 6 friends and actually have a drink together. And I'm just looking forward to getting to a point where you can actually start planning things and committing to things with a reasonable sense of assurance that it isn't going to get cancelled. So this weekend, for example, is the Latitude Music Festival, a great, really enjoyable festival. We haven't booked this year because we didn't think it would go ahead. It was thought there was a too great a risk that it would be cancelled, but it is going ahead. Right,
and today you're here, you're in England. Will you do anything differently?
Not really. I wore a face mask on the tube this morning, like all responsible people should. I'm going about my day like I have been over the last few weeks, so no great change for me.
What about for you, Alan?
Well, looking at the pictures of people in the clubs, I'm not sure if I'd had a night like that since the 90s, to be fair, but I'm going to be staying out the way of the traffic, I have to say. I'm anxious about going too far too fast. I think caution is going to pay off in the long run on this, so I'm going to be keeping pretty much as I am, I have to say.
Right, so you're feeling anxious and worried?
Yes.
Right.
I spent Saturday unveiling a COVID memorial at Bannockburn Crematorium to the victims of COVID. We're a long way out to get out of this yet, and this feeling of one more push, lads, we're almost there, I think that's really quite irresponsible of me to calm it all down.
Salma, will you do anything different?
The only thing that I'm going to change is try and be more present in an office, but I think for most people that still involves some level of restriction, and you'll be booking to be able to go in and use office spaces and things like that. But largely I'm going to stay pretty much as I have been, and will be using my face mask probably more frequently than is advised.
Right, Claire, what about you? Because you're in your office as such, aren't you?
I'm in my office, and I haven't left this office since last April, more or less. I've been in most weeks. Yeah, I'm going to do 2 things differently, Jo. One is tomorrow I'm going to a funeral of a patient of mine that died recently, and there will be singing. His daughter's going to be singing, and there will be many people there. And next Saturday, I will be going to my son's wedding, who had a COVID wedding last year with only 9 people. So this is going to be the reception with his friends and the remainder of his family. So I'm less anxious than the other people you've got as your guests, mainly, I think, because I've been, like many GPs, right in there right from the start. And to be fair, I think I often think about last Sunday when we were in the European Cup. I mean, that's really when it all changed, wasn't it? That's when millions and millions of people were celebrating in pubs and restaurants and clubs and in their own home and on the streets and singing and dancing and hugging and crying together. So
we've seen what's happened since.
I am slightly perplexed about today and about how much anxiety is about today. Well, in fact, we had, the European World Cup, or whatever it's called, the European Cup, and all the people, certainly in my area of London, really not at all following restrictions.
Right. Well, Alan, what you were trying to respond?
Well, I'd agree with the point, and that's why I watched the matches, and it was a painful enough experience watching the matches in themselves, but I watched them from home, not going out. And I'd absolutely agree that surely the evidence of people gathering in the way that they did and the spike in numbers that we've seen subsequent to that shows us what the risks are. So I'm back to what I said at the start, being cautious will pay off in the long term.
Claire?
I never know what that means, to be honest. I mean, clearly I'm going to wear a face mask in crowded places. I've got mine here for patients, but what I meant to say was that we already have got today, it was 7 or 8 days ago, and all the days before that, when different countries were having their people watching in these places. So clearly today marks a date, is the date in the sand. But I think in terms of, I think we've got to be really, really careful. There are many more people that die in winter from flu than will die today. And I'm not saying every death is tragic, every single one, but I think we've got to maybe start changing the narrative a little bit and not be so Armageddon as I think we are, and we have a tendency to all along this pandemic.
Salma, did you want to say something?
All I was going to say is that I think it's interesting that people, are talking about what happened at the Euros and how that sort of potentially increased case numbers. And I think this points to the fact that individual people are going to have different risk profiles, and they're going to take the precautions and, the next steps on a very individual level. So I think it's sort of hard to sort of categorize, what people are going to do, because the only way we're going to find this out is taking these small steps, these small cautious steps. And I would just say that I don't feel anxious about the situation, but I am going to be careful about the situation because we're going through a transition period. This is not kind of, the cliff edge and now we're done. It's a transition. So I think, I'm sort of in agreement with what Claire is saying, particularly around the fact that it's not Armageddon.
Right. Well, let's have a look at some of the other front pages, concentrating on a slightly different angle that was dominating the headlines over the weekend. The Metro. Chequers mate. Pinged Johnson forced to isolate after public outcry over VIP lane. And we can look at this headline in The Sun. PM isolation U-turn. Now do the right ping, Boris. Well, this was called a screeching U-turn yesterday by Number 10. The Prime Minister, along with the Chancellor Rishi Sunak, are now self-isolating after initially announcing they were taking part in a pilot scheme to test daily, having come into contact with someone who had tested positive, in this case the Health Secretary, Sajid Javid, for COVID. But following an outrage, public outrage, they reversed that decision. Now, Tony Blair, former Prime Minister, said yesterday, I don't want the Prime Minister to be in isolation at the moment. I need him at his desk doing his job. And there are exemptions for some people from the self-isolation rules. Alan, do you agree with Tony Blair?
No, I don't. I think one rule for them, one rule for the rest of us is an appalling precedent to set. And to be fair, they got to the right answer in the end. But there's no question, at the start of Sunday morning, there was a concerted effort to justify that they've been pinged, but they don't need to somehow self-isolate. Now, you can work while you're self-isolating. I've had 3 members of my team have been pinged over the last wee while. Not myself, I have to say. But people can work from home just as easily. And one rule for them, one rule for the rest is just not acceptable. And they got to the right answer, but they had to be dragged kicking and screaming towards it.
Stephen, that's true.
Yeah, there was a wobble, and I think there was the right outcome in the end. But you can understand that their immediate reaction would be like every other person who has a busy, complicated life, their reaction would be when they get pinged, which is, my goodness, how can we make this work given my workload, given my circumstances? And there was that option open to them. It is a real scheme. It's not just some invented fig leaf as a kind of get out of jail free card. There was a real pilot scheme happening. But I think it was the right decision that they made to self-isolate because of the message it sends to the country. But I think there's a wider question which it highlights, which is about this whole business of self-isolation at the moment. And Tony Blair has also been speaking about that. We've got hundreds of thousands of people self-isolating at the moment. It's creating real pinch points for business. And the government's now made an exception for key NHS workers, and it probably needs to look at some other critical workers, perhaps people in logistics as well. Otherwise, we're going to be in for a very challenging 4 weeks.
Right. Well, let's have a listen to Boris Johnson. You called it a wobble by Number 10. This was recorded at Chequers, where he's self-isolating. Here he is.
We did look briefly at the idea of us taking part in the pilot scheme, which allows people to test daily. But I think it's far more important that everybody sticks to the same rules.
Right. It wasn't briefly looked at, was it, Stephen? I mean, that's just not a credible position. A press release was sent out yesterday at 8 o'clock stating exactly what was going on, that the Prime Minister and the Chancellor were taking part in this pilot scheme. And then Robert Jenrick, the Communities Secretary, was on the airwaves defending the policy.
Yeah, it was an option that was available to them. The first response from them and their teams, there would have been a discussion amongst their private offices as well, would be, yes, let's use that pilot scheme to ensure that the Chancellor of the Exchequer
It was a mistake,
and the Prime Minister of this country can get on with some very, very critical work. But there was a bigger concern, which is around public perception. And, thank goodness, we live in a democracy where public opinion counts, where we have leaders who are responsive to feelings that are communicated on social media and elsewhere, and we had the right decision in the end.
Claire, do you agree with what Stephen said?
I don't agree at all. What Boris Johnson was asked to participate in was a study, not a pilot, a study of randomising people to either testing every day or to this, to isolation. So it was a proper study, and I think it would have actually done an awful lot to understand what the best way forward had he subjected himself to being randomised into one of the two groups. So that's the first thing. The second thing is you can't drive a train remotely. And yesterday, many people listening to this would have been stuck at Euston Station, where there weren't enough staff to run the trains because of the pinging. And I think we either have and trust the vaccine, or we live in isolation for the rest of our lives. That doesn't mean if you've been infected, you should be out. I think if you are currently suffering from COVID-19, that's completely different rules. But if you've been vaccinated, twice vaccinated, and going back to your first speaker, what he says, one rule for others, the others for others. If NHS staff are now going to be given exemption, then that is one rule for one group of people and another rule for another group. And then you'll say, well, actually, it's got to be hospitality, it's got to be train drivers, bus drivers. So either we make this sensible for everybody, or we do the rule, which is pinging, which is, and just before I finish, one of my GP colleagues has been pinged 5 times. He's been 5 times in isolation. And today, this morning, we have 7 members of staff not available to help with our patients coming through the door. So while some people can work remotely, there are hundreds of jobs that cannot be done remotely.
Right, well, so Claire obviously thinking that Boris Johnson should have stuck the course then with being part of this study, as she correctly says. It was a PR disaster, though, wasn't it?
I think this is where you have to draw the distinction, because what might make logical sense for a study, which the Prime Minister will be participating in, actually becomes political fodder. And more than that, if the government is so keen, which it has been, to send out messages, saying that people should self-isolate and we don't want people to delete the NHS app, then this is actually an opportunity to set an example. And I think that is the other way of looking at this situation. Instinctively, yes, everybody who will be pinged will be worried and sort of thinking about how they might be able to get an exemption. But, if your message is we need you to self-isolate because we need to understand, the case numbers, then it actually could have been a very positive PR opportunity. That said, I think the distinction between frontline workers and politicians, who will be treated differently, I think people will perceive that differently. And I would have no problem with NHS people being able to have a testing regime rather than self-isolating, because we know we need them on the front line. I think politicians are slightly different. We've proven that we can work remotely, and Tony Blair might say that you need to be at the desk, but I think if we've proven that that's not the case anymore.
Right, and we've heard this morning, I think it was actually announced last night, that some NHS staff will be exempt from having to self-isolate, as you've been talking about, if they are pinged and can test daily instead. Is that the right policy, Alan?
I think Stephen's made the most important point in all this discussion, actually. We do need to look at the implications of pinging and how that's creating pinch points in the travel sector, the transport sector, the NHS as well. But we don't do that retrospectively on a Sunday morning because it suits the Prime Minister. And I mean, I do feel for him stuck in his country seat there without a hairbrush in sight. I mean, it must be dreadful for him.
I know, I can feel your heart bleeding for him.
What a thing. But they got to the right answer, and there is a genuine issue here to be looked at. Of course there is, and we need to keep that under review. But we need to keep that under review on the basis of the risk and the numbers as we go forward. Right.
The pressure will be growing, no doubt, on Sajid Javid, who has tested... I'll come to you. Sorry, Claire, I didn't hear you coming in. I'll come back to you in just a moment. But, Stephen, just first of all, on the idea of bringing forward that date of August the 16th, which is when Sajid Javid says they'll move to a daily testing regime. Should it be brought forward?
No, I think it's probably, on balance, the right thing for the government to stick to that date. I think sticking to a plan is the right way forward. We are opening up more of the economy today with easing of restrictions in England, so inevitably that will mean a further increase in cases. So actually keeping this tool in place is, on balance, the right thing to do. But what I would just emphasise is that there are really critical parts of the economy which are feeling labour shortages at the moment. For example, HGV drivers, logistics, and probably a case for keeping that under review and for government intervening if there's a problem in the next few weeks.
Claire?
Well, all I was going to say, sorry, Jo, was that that's why we need academic studies. And it's not for the media or the PR leaders to say what should or shouldn't be done. It's for studies. And had the Prime Minister engaged in this very good academic study, we would know, hopefully we will soon know, what is the best thing for all of us, not just for train drivers or NHS staff, but for all of us. So I am disappointed that the science went out the window and the PR and the headlines came instead.
Salma?
There are other people with similar patterns that can participate in the study. It doesn't necessarily have to be the Prime Minister and the Chancellor, I think, is the argument.
Yeah, I agree with you there, but wouldn't it have been good, the fact that the Prime Minister would have been entering an academic study, because that would have actually given us such a good message that we need to be guided by science, not by PR and the media and the headlines on our newspapers.
Right, well, everyone seems to be in joyous agreement on that. Let's just show you this page from the Scottish Daily Mail. Vaccines chaos, a threat to freedom. Growing doubt over August the 9th date for lifting restrictions as England reopens for business. Have you actually missed your target in terms of vaccinations?
We're finding that the 18 to 30-year-old age group is is not coming forward in the way that other groups did, so we're having logistical issues there. But we're on track, we're on target. I have to say, in my circle, most people I know are enthusiastic about getting their jab rather than not getting their jab. So there's work to be done there, of course, but we're still working in progress.
Right, I mean, the report says 500,000 Scots have yet to have their jabs. That doesn't sound like you're on track, certainly not for today's date or for this week, if you want to reopen on August the 9th. So is that at risk?
Well, everybody's been offered. What we're seeing, and we're seeing this in England as well, is the take-up rates. Now, that's something that we all need to encourage people to get their jags. We need to call out misinformation, disinformation when we see it. There's been a lot of bad actors have been spreading nonsense. The vaccines are safe. The vaccines have been tested. We need to get people vaccinated to the greatest extent possible. And I really would take every platform to urge people to do that. Right.
So do you think there is a problem with messaging?
It's been a wee bit mixed, but I have to say most people that have been getting in touch with me have not been trying to call out vaccines. They've been trying to actually get their vaccine faster, and all adults in that group have now been offered their vaccine, so it's a question of people finding time to get there and get them. All right, well, let's listen to the Shadow Health Secretary, Jonathan Ashworth. Here he is.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think this is irreversible, as Sajid Javid and Boris Johnson promised, because it is growing so fast. The thing with COVID, it grows really, really quickly. And other countries that threw off all their restrictions, like the Netherlands, for example, they threw off all the restrictions on the 26th of June, and their infection rates went up almost on a vertical axis. So they started closing things like nightclubs. Israel have brought back mask wearing and are looking at going back into a lockdown. And Israel are one of the most vaccinated countries in the world. So you cannot say this is irreversible.
All right, well, let's talk about that, and particularly Jonathan Ashworth mentions the situation in the Netherlands. Welcome to Robin Pascoe, the founder and editor of the website Dutch News. Robin, restrictions were eased in the Netherlands at the end of last month. Tell us what happened.
Well, they decided overnight, basically, that the infection rate in the Netherlands was really low, around 500 new cases a day. So it was a good time to get the Netherlands open for the summer. We were promised it was going to be a great summer. They abandoned limits on group sizes, for example. They gave restaurants and cafes more leeway to have more guests. And they introduced a system called Test for Entry, which allowed people to go into clubs, for example, or to attend festivals if they could prove they'd either a negative coronavirus test, if they had had coronavirus, or if they had been vaccinated. And that's where the problem seems to have been, because since then, the number of positive cases have rocketed. They went up by 500% in some weeks. They've stabilised slightly in the last few days at around 10,000 cases a day. But as you can imagine, from 500 to 10,000 has caused a bit of a shock. And a lot of the measures which they brought in, they've now reversed again. Clubs are now closed. Festivals have all been cancelled. One of the festivals, which was given the go-ahead, attended by the Mayor of Utrecht, for example, they've had nearly 1,000 infections, which they can now trace back to that festival. And this was people who were technically supposed to be covered and will not get coronavirus because they've been tested or because they've been vaccinated. But one of the problems with the vaccination thing, for example, was the government said, you can be considered vaccinated, fully vaccinated, if you had your jab in the morning, and then in the evening you could go to a... Now that they got rid of pretty quickly when everybody had been saying you're kind of wrong on that one, because every expert says you need at least 14 weeks for a vaccine to kick in.
What about the apology from Mark Rutte, the Prime Minister?
Well, he apologised in a way. He said he was sorry that they had relaxed the rules so quickly and that he had failed to acknowledge the mistakes that the government made. But that stemmed from a press conference which was given when everything started to go wrong. And it wasn't actually, I'm sorry we opened everything up too early. It was more of, I'm sorry we didn't do a very good job at the time of telling you what we were doing. For example, the mixed message and something which, I don't know, maybe in the background of people's minds in the UK, is that the idea of allowing people to go to a club when they'd been vaccinated in the morning was to get young people to actually go and get vaccinated. And that seemed to have worked because there was a huge surge in people actually going out and getting a jab and then going dancing, 12 hours later.
Yes, absolutely. I hear your point there. Robin, thank you very much. I know we can't make direct parallels with the UK, and also to say that hospital admissions apparently did not go up significantly in the Netherlands. Nearly 3/4 of new cases were in young people, and you heard Robin say that there seemed to be a misunderstanding about how quickly you could go out and socialise once you'd had either your first or second vaccination. You are supposed to wait at least a couple of weeks. But should this be seen as a warning sign for the UK, Stephen?
Well, yes, there are always lessons to be learned from the experience of different countries abroad. And Jonathan Ashworth earlier mentioned the case of Israel, which led the world in terms of its vaccination programme. But since then, the experience has been that they've had to dial back on some of the easing that they'd planned. So the lesson here is that there isn't one kind of key freedom moment, that actually there's a process of dialing up and dialing back of restrictions in response to new variants, in response to the way the virus is behaving. There's a lot of unknowns out there. Right. And I think this is going to be the scenario that we're living with now for at least probably the next year.
So you wouldn't have called it Freedom Day?
Well, I can understand why the Prime Minister chose that, but to give people a sense of go forward. And the Prime Minister is brilliant at giving the country that kind of sense of optimism and morale.
You've just contradicted that by saying...
It was in the context of emphasising the importance of getting vaccinated and buying into the vaccination programme. So I completely understand that. But the experience since then is we do need to take a bit more of a cautious approach.
Right. Alan, I mean, one of the things to take into account is the level of vaccination. More than 46% of the Netherlands' adult population, mostly from older age groups, is fully vaccinated. That actually compares unfavourably with the UK, as you would probably know, because we're talking about 66% of adults fully vaccinated by the end of last week, and almost 90% had a first dose. So isn't it right that the UK is easing more quickly?
I think the biggest lessons from the Netherlands is that the best battle plan doesn't survive first contact with the enemy. And we are dealing with a deadly disease that will take any opportunity it can get, that doesn't care about our spin or headlines or newspapers or anything else. And if it's given the opportunity, the numbers on this can move really, really fast. So because of the vaccination rollout, we're in a better position than most. But as I said at the start of the programme, caution will pay off in the long term. And just because we can doesn't mean we should. And I really would urge everybody to cock canny and look after each other.
Right. Claire, is it sensible to compare the UK to other countries?
Oh, well, yes, of course. We have to learn from other countries. What I would say is there still is the risk to the NHS. And I think, to me, that's the most important caution that we need to do. We need to be looking at hospital admissions. We certainly need to be looking at deaths. And as you probably know, we're already more or less in a winter crisis at the moment, and we're miles away from winter. So I'm in broad agreement with your other speakers. The only caveat I would have is that clearly the Netherlands were wrong by saying it was safe if you just had it in the morning. You're right, we need to wait weeks. But yesterday there were queues and queues of young people for these pop-up vaccination centres to get vaccinated ahead of today. So I really hope the 18 to 30-year-olds will get themselves vaccinated, because that's their best bet. Whilst they may not die from COVID, they may certainly, if they get it, suffer the consequences of it.
Right. I mean, Salma, Jeremy Hunt, former Health Secretary, said if they are still going up, that's the cases, number of cases, as the schools are coming back, he's talking about September, I think we're going to have to reconsider some very difficult decisions. How we behave over the next few weeks will have a material difference. Can you see, as Stephen was saying, restrictions coming back in the autumn, or preparation for it anyway?
I can absolutely see restrictions coming back in the autumn. And I think this is why we should view today's opening as a sort of cautious first step into trying to get back to normality. I think what the shape of those restrictions is going to look like will be the question, because I think the idea is that we don't want to go back into these lockdown, not lockdown cycles, because all it seems to do is delay rather than stop. So I think it's the kind of restrictions that will be then presented to us that will be the interesting question, whether we go back to a tier system, whether we go back to localised lockdowns, whether our data improves so that we can start tracing things better. I mean, obviously, this is part of what the app is supposed to be doing. So that would be the interesting thing from my perspective.
Right. I mean, Professor Neil Ferguson, Stephen, whose research shaped the government's lockdown strategy, says we could now see 200,000 cases a day. If that happens, is that a metric at which you would like to see some of the restrictions coming back in, some of the easings being reversed?
Well, I'm not qualified to talk about specific numbers, but what I would say is that there is some good science behind the government's plan about reopening during the summer to avoid a larger spike in the autumn. This isn't just a political programme that's driving today's announcement. There is actually good science behind it.
Right. Would you like to see Scotland reverse some of the easings if they come in on August the 9th, if case rates surge in that way?
I'm similarly not qualified to comment on that, but we are also taking some of the restrictions away in Scotland. We are relaxing as well. We're just doing it at a more cautious level. And I think that's just about right for where we are. And I wouldn't decry anything that's happening elsewhere. But I think caution will really pay off in the long term on this. And if we're looking at a reversal, we need to do that on the basis of what the risk is at the proper time.
Right, but your plan isn't irreversible either.
I think politicians saying anything in this is irreversible is really silly.
Well, that's fair enough. Let's show everybody the front page of The Guardian. UK children about to turn 18 could be first in COVID vaccine queue. Those with underlying conditions could also be prioritised in any jab programme, Minister suggests. Now, this is the decision. It's taken quite a long time for the JCVI, the Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunisation, to talk about and advise the government on whether under-18s should be vaccinated. There's a statement expected later on today in the House of Commons by the Vaccines Minister, Nadhim Zahawi. But let's talk to our health reporter, Jim Reid. Jim, what are the options that are being looked at by the government in terms of vaccinating under-18s?
Hi, Joe. As you say, it's ministers in each of the devolved nations that are going to have to take this decision. But essentially, it comes down to this recommendation from these 20 independent scientists on the JCVI. Now, they were asked to look specifically at 12 to 17-year-olds and whether they should get the jab. It looks like, at the moment, we'll get the official announcement around 3:30 today, that is unlikely to happen. As things stand at the moment, actually, 16 and 17-year-olds in the UK that have an underlying health condition or who live with someone who has a very suppressed immune system, compromised immune system, can get access to the jab. It looks like what they're going to do is extend that downwards to 12-year-olds and upwards. So they wouldn't automatically get the jab, but if, like I say, they have this underlying condition or they live with someone who's particularly vulnerable, then they can be offered it. Also, as you said in the introduction, to people that are just about to turn 18, so in the 3 months before, they could be given it. But it looks like for the moment they're going to keep it under review, but for the moment it's not going to be a widespread policy to vaccinate secondary school children in the UK. Can you give us a sort of a flavour of what other countries have decided to do? I mean, we know that the US is vaccinating younger teenagers. It's really interesting looking at the international comparisons here. So as you say, in the US, they've already vaccinated millions of children, in other countries as well. So France have started their vaccination rollout of younger children. In other countries, so Austria have made the same decision. Denmark have made the decision, just about to start. In Germany, interestingly, it looks like they're going to make the same decision, which is going to be made here. So again, it's vulnerable children that are going to be offered this jab. It's worth pointing out there are some kind of interesting cultural differences about vaccinations across the world. In France, for example, essentially other childhood vaccines like measles, mumps, rubella are sort of compulsory. You can't go to a state school without getting that vaccine card. In this country, we've never gone that far, although the government has flirted with the idea. So maybe that plays into this decision. I mean, there's no suggestion that the COVID vaccine would be compulsory for children, but this idea that maybe parents should be given more choice has come into it. Also, apparently, reading between the lines here, scientists have looked at some of the side effects, very rare side effects in young males in the United States. This inflammation of the heart, apparently linked to the Pfizer vaccine, very rare, called myocarditis, is one reason why at the moment it looks like they're not going to go as far as to recommend this for all children in the UK.
Jim, thank you very much. Claire, what's your reaction? Would you support the vaccination of all children in the UK?
Yeah, thank you. And a very good report. It's, of course, a balance, isn't it? It's a balance of the complications of COVID. So we know that COVID in children can cause a very, very rare inflammatory process versus the balance of complications of the vaccine. And as you've heard, it can lead to this very rare myocarditis. There's also added to that the risk of getting COVID. And we know from what you've just said that there's a lot of COVID swirling around the community. So I think it's wise to do the high-risk children, the 12 to 18-year-old. I suspect what will happen is that many parents and children will want to be vaccinated anyway, because if our lives are going to be restricted unless we have the vaccine, that may push some people into choosing to have it, even though they're not at risk. But it's clearly a balance, and I'm really pleased that the government and the committee are looking at this, because it's a very important area to be looking at now.
Salma, what's your view?
Well, the only thing that I'd like to have a bit more clarity on is, I mean, I understand that sort of transmission in the community, which is, increased when children particularly are going to school. It would be great to have them vaccinated because it will limit that transmissibility. But the thing that I wonder about is what happens then to the rest of the world in terms of vaccine equality, because there's only, at any given point, a finite supply. And I think being able to share vaccinations with third world countries as well is self-interested. It's not just about, having a kind heart. It's about being able to ensure that we can open up globally as well. So I think I think I'd be interested to know more about sort of the vaccine supply issue, and then what happens, if we are now giving it to 12 to 18-year-olds, or even the most vulnerable. What do we do sort of more widely globally?
Claire?
I absolutely agree. I mean, there is a moral and ethical issue that you've just brought up. If we vaccinate 12 to 18-year-olds who have very, very small risk of dying, and yet we've got whole tranches of the world without any vaccine, then that certainly does play into how we deal with this on a worldwide basis. You're absolutely right about that. I think it's a difficult decision to make. I think on balance, children will be offered vaccinations here, and I think on balance, the parents and they themselves will take it up.
Stephen, do you sympathise with, I'm sure there will be many parents who will feel uncomfortable about the idea of vaccinating children when the risk of COVID is so low?
Yeah, totally. I think there'll be a lot of parents who feel exactly that, who'll be unsure about it, not convinced it's the right thing for their children. And I think this is going to be one of the key rows of the autumn, actually. around the vaccination of children, because clearly that's the direction of travel. It might be that JCVI comes out with a relatively cautious approach for now, but you just get the sense that this is where this whole thing is going. And I think there will be a lot of parents who, even though they're double jabbed themselves, will be thinking, I'm not sure this is quite right for my children. And you know, I sympathise with that. And I don't have any medical or scientific reason necessarily for saying that.
No.
It's just an instinctive response.
Yeah, is yours the same, an instinctive response to the idea of it? Or, as one of the scientists suggested, Adam Finn, I think they also had to look at the issue of school closures again, children being harmed by the idea of loss of education, perhaps not a direct health impact, but still an important part of their lives.
It certainly is, and where I very much agree with Stephen that some parents will be reticent of this, some parents will be very keen to get it, as a middle-class pushy parent saying that we might not get to ski this year unless the kids are vaccinated. So there's a balance to be struck here, and all of our conversation here is speculative because we've not had the statement yet, we've not seen the JCVI rulings. So the Scottish Government's taken its line very closely from the JCVI, so I really would wait to see what that is before we speculate too much.
Right, but what's your sort of personal opinion on this? Would you feel comfortable with the idea of vaccinating children, if that is indeed what is suggested by the JCVI?
My personal opinion doesn't matter a damn in any of this.
It does. It does, and that's why we've got you here, for your personal opinion, and you're good at expressing it on other issues.
I'm happy to bump my gums on anything you like, but we've not seen the report yet. We've not seen Nadeem Zahawi's statement, so let's see what it is. I think there is a case, particularly for vulnerable children or children who might pass on to vulnerable adults. That makes sense to me, but I'm a lawyer, not a doctor, so let's put my opinion in context.
All right, we're going to move on and talk about something completely different. Let me just show you this headline in the Daily Telegraph. Ruth Davidson. I'm astonished, she says, Boris Johnson signed off on peerage because, yes, she is going into the House of Lords tomorrow. She was previously a member of the Scottish Parliament, leader of the Tories in Scotland, and that means, in theory, she could now become a member of the government. She's seen as a star of the party. Stephen, would you like to see her in government?
I would love to see her in government. My only regret about seeing her go to the House of Lords is that she's not coming to the House of Commons, where I think she would have the ideal platform for her range of talents. Look, I mean, she's bright, she's funny, she doesn't give a damn about offending people when she wants to speak her mind and make her point. She's exactly the kind of person we need at Westminster, liven the place up and get some hard truths spoken at times.
All right, I think I know where you stand there. Now, are you prepared to give us your opinion on this, Alan?
This one,
it's funny that. I wondered why.
Well, it's less damaging. It's less damaging if I speculate on this one. Now, look, the SNP boycotts the House of Lords. We don't think it's a credible organisation. I've got friends in the House of Lords who are doing their best to reform it, who are doing their best to put in a shift. That's all fine. But the fact is, Ruth Davidson has run away from the voters of Scotland. She ran away from Edinburgh Central. She could have stood again, but she didn't. And she now never needs to worry about democracy for the rest of her days. And that's a poor show. That's a poor way to run any country, much less mine. And that will be judged by the people of Scotland on its merits.
Stephen?
Well, I'm tempted to say to our Scottish national friend, he would say that, wouldn't he? I mean, they've been rather jealous of Ruth Davidson in recent years. I mean, she has lit up Scottish politics in a way that few other people have done, and I think also at a UK level. And I think her coming to Westminster would be a very good thing for the union as well.
Right. Salma, we're going to show everybody the picture, the infamous picture of Ruth Davidson in the tank. You may remember it. There she is, getting into it now. What's your response to what Alan said?
I actually think, and I just want to echo what Stephen said, that actually for the UK, I think it's brilliant to have such a big Scottish figure coming into the House of Lords. And I think it's important in terms of both chambers to have a good union present. So I think actually her coming down here is strengthening our engagement with Scotland. And I think we've needed that for a very long time. And I think Ruth personally, I mean, I don't know her particularly well, but I think she brought something to politics which was about relatability. And so few other politicians are able to do that. I mean, even at a push, you would say Boris Johnson could do it because he sort of breaks every rule of politics. And I think Ruth Davidson is sort of made in the same mould. So I'm very excited to see what she's going to do. And I'm very excited to see what might happen if she is brought forward into a government role. I think it would make things very interesting.
Right, is that likely, bearing in mind Ruth Davidson hasn't been shy about expressing her disdain for Boris Johnson in the past?
Well, that's true, but I think, if anything, Boris Johnson is quite a wily, practical prime minister, and if it suits, the agenda, and if he thinks he can make good use of it, I think he may be tempted to bring Ruth Davidson back into frontline politics.
Claire, do you have a comment on this?
Well, I'm a doctor, not a politician, but I do think that Ruth Davidson seems like a really very decent person and a really lovely person.
Right, strong advocate for the union, Alan. That could be problematic for you.
Bring it on. Ruth Davidson ran away from the people of Glasgow to go and stand for Edinburgh Central. She won Edinburgh Central, to be fair, but she didn't stand in it again. She ran away to the House of Lords, and the House of Lords has no democratic legitimacy. No, I don't take anything away from Ruth personally, but the House of Lords has no democratic legitimacy, and the idea that the people of Scotland can be told by a baroness from a palace on the Thames what's good for us just won't fly. And if you think that's going to save the union, keep that coming.
All right, let's just finally show you this story in the Mail on Sunday. The former Speaker of the House, John Bercow, breaks pledge to delay pension, then claims his wife Sally made him do it. Just to give you a bit of explanation, this was a story yesterday reporting that Mr Bercow has gone back on a pledge to defer his Speaker's pension until he's 65. It turns out he began accepting the £35,000 a year payment when he retired, age 56. Stephen, what do you make of the story?
Oh, I stopped commenting on John Bercow's stories long ago. I mean, I did see the story yesterday. I saw the headline. I thought the thing that caught my eye was him blaming his wife for it. I thought it was a bit unfortunate.
Well, yes. I mean, what the statement actually said, shortly before I left office, this is John Bercow's statement, Sally and I discussed the matter. She emphasised that the pension had always been part of my employment package and I should therefore take it, especially as, in her words, the Johnson government was breaking conventions and promises left, right and centre. I agreed with that sentiment and have been taking my Speaker's pension in line with my predecessor's practice since I retired. Again, what is your response? What do you think your constituents will think of that?
Well, none of them have raised it with me, and normally they're quite quick over the weekend if they see something in the headlines.
Well, it only happened yesterday.
Well, sure, but they're very quick off the mark. I mean, given the pledge that he made, then he probably should have stuck to it. And I guess it's one of those things where people who don't like John Bercow, it's another reason for them to get angry. But I imagine there'll be an awful lot of people just focusing on other issues, like what we've been talking about earlier, COVID, and getting on with their lives.
Salma, your response?
I mean, if it's a matter that his predecessor, took a pension, I mean, I understand there's some sort of charge of hypocrisy, etc. But it's sort of his private business, whether he decides to take a pension or not, albeit taxpayer funded. But I mean, like Stephen says, I think there are bigger things to worry about and comment on than this.
Right. I mean, Alan, it is quite a lot of money. It could have saved £430,000 to the Exchequer, and he has gone back on the pledge because the current government breaks promises left, right and centre, as he said. Is that a good enough reason?
It seems a curious one, I have to say, and I confess I've not paid it much heed, but if you make a commitment, I think you should stick to it. If you change your mind, I don't think you should blame your partner, but if he's entitled to the pension, then let's look at all that in the round as to should a pension be payable immediately on exiting service, or should it be payable on 65. But likewise, I think this is pretty much a Westminster bubble story that I've not been contacted by anybody in Stirling about at all.
Right, well, as I say, it's only in the last 24 hours. Claire, how do you think the public, you being a member of the public, as we all are, I suppose, will view this?
Listen, I have such sympathy for politicians or whatever political persuasion, and we have no idea, and I think Selma touched on this, what his personal life is, whether he needed the money, whether he needed the lump sum, whether his wife maybe did sort of say, listen, I think you should take it. So I think this is, I agree also, if he'd already said he wasn't going to take it, then it's slightly hypocritical. But listen, I don't think we should blame our politicians as much as we do. I think they're humans, they suffer, and they have normal human fallibilities as we all do.
Right. Do you think people have got it in for the former Speaker, Stephen? I mean, you actually alluded to the fact that it just depends on your views about John Bercow. Is this what it comes down to?
Well, he enraged an awful lot of people, particularly in his latter years as Speaker.
You included?
During the... on some points, so on some of the Brexit arguments that we were having, I thought that he compromised his position of Speaker in some of the procedural decisions that were made. I perhaps don't feel quite as strongly even about that as some of my colleagues who were absolutely furious about it. But, he's a Marmite individual. He's got a lot of talent nevertheless. And it depends on which side of the fence that you fall with John, really.
Right. Salma, do you agree with that? Or very briefly, we've only got a few seconds.
Yes, completely. And I think the problem is that, in politics, as lots of people do when they're high profile, you make a lot of enemies as well as friends.
All right, we'll leave it there. Thank you to all of my guests for today. And I will be back tomorrow at 12:15. From all of us here, bye-bye.